Hello and welcome to Kia e-Niro Diaries. It's the 5th of March today, so in about 10 days time we would have owned the e-Niro 2 years. So when that day comes around, I'll do a video talking about what the ownership experience has been like with all the stats, kilometres driven, money spent, all that kind of stuff. So as you've probably gathered from some of my other videos, it's not just the e-Niro I like to talk about. It's the whole sort of car industry generally. I grew up about, a quarter of a mile from the factory gates of a British Leyland plant where my dad worked in the 60s and 70s. So I've kind of had an interest in the industry for a long time. And I'm also passionate about getting off of fossil fuels and realizing that electric motive power is just a superior way to get around, not just as cars to drive and to own, but obviously they're much better for the environment. Someone else who's really passionate about that, even more so than me, I guess, is Robert Llewellyn, who runs the Fully Charged show. It's a great YouTube channel. I have to say that my decision to buy an electric car was a lot to do with following his videos, which I've done for many years, and he does great stuff. The thing is, though, he sometimes gets in a bit of a rant about things, and those rants are funny because, after all, he's a comedy actor. It's very entertaining, and it's all good factual stuff. Well, most of it, anyway. So there are some recurring themes in Robert Llewellyn's entertaining rants. One is why are people still buying these gas-guzzling cars, especially the high-end luxury cars, where there's actually more electric vehicle competition than there is in the sort of medium and sort of smaller end of the car market. So that's one of his things. And, he also says because they've done some really good videos on electric buses, which of course, there's a city in China, Shenzhen, I think it's called, that have the entire bus fleet has been converted to electric, like 16,000 buses. I think they've got like twice as many buses as Transport for London. So why are people still buying diesel buses? And the other thing he goes on about is the price of electric cars. Why even the sort of medium range cars, like he's recently reviewed the Vauxhall or Opel, as it's called in Europe, Mokka E, which he really liked, but it's very expensive compared to the petrol versions, and it's fully loaded with all the extras, if you like. Why aren't they doing a basic version that they can sell cheaper? Well, just looking at those two issues, the first one around, why are people still buying big petrol and diesel cars when there are electric alternatives? Well, it's just really a question of production capacity. We've got the capacity in the world apparently to produce about 90 million what they call light-duty vehicles, cars and vans, every year. And according to an article I read in The Economist last year, there are about 1,000 factories globally that can produce these cars and the engines that go in them. And it's taken many, many decades to build up that productive capacity. There's an enormous amount of capital tied up in producing fossil fuel powered cars. The Economist reckons it's $1.3 trillion. That's just an unbelievable amount of money. So obviously the car companies are not going to just sort of scrap that and wave that goodbye. They have to phase it in gradually. Now, there is obviously a constraining factor. Even if everybody wanted an electric car and the manufacturing capacity to make the cars were there, there's just not the capacity to make the batteries. So according to a company called SNE Research, last year the world's battery factories turned out 142 gigawatt hours of battery capacity, and that's to supply hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and purely electric. Now, if every one of those batteries, for example, went into something like the Kia e-Niro, which has got a 64 kilowatt hour battery. That's enough to make 2.2 million Kia e-Niros, so pure electric cars. Okay, but as the article said, this is providing batteries for hybrids like the Toyota Prius, the Niro hybrid, the Hyundai Ioniq hybrid. There's lots and lots of hybrid models now. And in 2020, about 4.5 million, I think 4.4 million hybrid electric vehicles were sold. And 3.2 million cars with a plug were sold. So that's either battery electric or plug-in hybrids. Now, it's interesting that the non-plug-in hybrids, or as Toyota would tell you, the self-charging hybrids, typically have a lithium-ion battery of between about 1 and 2 kilowatt hours. I think the Niro's hybrid's battery is 1.2 kilowatts. And a typical plug-in hybrid, they go between about 7 and 8. I think the Niro plug-in hybrid is about 7.5 to 8 kilowatt hours. And the bigger ones, there are Volvos and BMWs and Mercedes where the batteries are about maybe 12 kilowatt hours. So still very small in comparison to a pure EV. And in the world of battery electric vehicles, if you like, that's how you distinguish between a plug-in hybrid and a pure electric vehicle. The very small cars, such as the Smart and the Citroën and Peugeot cars that actually we see running around here, they're used by local authorities. They only have batteries of about 18 kilowatt hours, and then you've got all the way up to the big Teslas, which now have 100 kilowatt hour batteries, and you've got everything in between. The Niro is 64, the Renault Zoe is 50, 52, that kind of thing. Okay, so that 142 gigawatt hours was providing all the automotive light duty vehicle batteries. So that's really the limitation. We can wish as much as we like to see the end of fossil fuels and see rapid growth in electric car buying. But bear in mind, of course, that when we bought the Niro in March 2019, there were about 5 million electric vehicles on the road, and at the end of 2020, according to the stats I've read, there were about 10.5 million. So in about 20 months, that's doubled. By the end of this, they reckon there's going to be about another 4 million, maybe this year, electric vehicle sales. That's cars with a plug-in hybrids and battery electric. So we'll be up to 14 million electric cars in the world. Now, that's an interesting number because there are apparently about 1.4 billion light-duty vehicles in the world. That's cars and vans. So when we get to 14 million, we're at the magic 1%, which is when things do start to take off. And I mean, that's already happened in Europe last year. We went from about 3% of new car sales being cars with a plug to 10%. This year it's going to be somewhere between 12 and 15. But say the constraint really is the battery manufacturing. And there are factories being built all over the place. I mean, just in Europe, there's new factories going up in France. There's one being built, will start operation this year. It's a pilot plant for Peugeot, Citroën, Total. It's a joint effort between the car company and the oil company, strangely enough. And Total bought a company called Saft about 4 years ago. And Saft are a battery company based in Bordeaux that have been supplying batteries to the aviation and shipping industries for about 100 years. I think the US Navy are a customer of theirs. So the technology is good. They know what they're doing. But there's battery factories going up in France, Sweden, Germany, Hungary, Slovakia, and that's just Europe. And in fact, most of the battery factories that are being built are in China. And there's factories going up all over in the United States as well. So, say it took many decades to build the capacity to make 90 million cars and vans a year with internal combustion engines in them. So this is not a kind of a 5-minute job to replace all of that. Apparently there's about $300 billion worth of investment going into electric vehicles every year. That's obviously not just the battery manufacturer, that's the design, development and building, changing out the equipment in the factories that are needed to make electric vehicles. And it's growing pretty fast. Some estimates I've read say that around 2025 there'll be about 500 to 600 gigawatt hours worth of battery capacity out there. So that's going to be enough to make about 12-15 million electric vehicles. So you can see the way things are going. But even by the end of this decade, with rapid growth and the usual kind of life cycle of cars taken into account, I think in Europe the average life cycle of a car is 16 and a half years. Obviously, there's a lot running around here from the 1990s and even 1980s, but we live in a part of France where they never put salt on the road and things generally don't rust like they did in the UK. So it's different in different countries, but generally it's going to take about 20 years to churn out the whole of the installed base of fossil fuel cars. But by the end of this decade, I should think about 1 in 10 of the world's cars on the road will be electric. That's just sort of a combination of reading up on the subject and getting a lot of different views. We're talking about going from 14 million cars, electric cars on the road this year, to maybe 140, 150 million by the end of the decade. And that's going to start to eat into fossil fuel use. I mean, if you look at countries like Norway, where they've, last year I think they sold 70% of all new cars that were sold were cars with a plug. But even in that country, which is a small population, I think there's only about 3 million cars on the roads of Norway, as opposed to like 35 million in countries like the UK and France. But it's taking a long time to replace all of those, even in Norway. But it's interesting that now about 10%, 12% of all the cars on the road need a plug, not a pump. And so petrol stations there are starting to close. They're seeing a big drop off in the sales of the fuel, but it takes a long time, to accumulate that sort of population of electric vehicles that will have an effect on the sale of petrol and diesel. So the other recurring element in Robert Llewellyn's rants is the price of electric vehicles. And of course, we've been hearing for years that the price of batteries are what really dictates the price of electric cars. And there's been huge progress made in the past sort of 5-6 years. I think if you go back to the beginning of the last decade, you were talking about, the early Nissan Leafs were about $1,000 per kilowatt hour. And the accepted wisdom is that once you get down to $100 per kilowatt hour, then electric cars will be able to compete on price with petrol cars. Now, the price has fallen dramatically, and the last time I looked, it was about $130 per kilowatt hour. But of course, we're still seeing electric cars being, in the showrooms much more expensive than their petrol and diesel equivalents. And this is one of the things that Fully Charged Show are always sort of talking about and campaigning to get the electric cars cheaper. But actually, it's quite logical why they are more expensive. And as someone who's worked in marketing and product management for a lot of my life, I can say that I would do exactly the same. I would price them high. And the reason is this, is that if you've got the demand for a product, but you're constrained on supply for whatever reason, then you only ever bother to sell the high-end version of that product where you make the most margin. So, for example, if you buy the basic car in any range of cars, you're going to have to pay extra if you want to add a sunroof or a better stereo or adaptive cruise control, lane keep assist, all of those things. Whereas for the manufacturer to add those things on in the manufacturing process, it's an incremental cost. It's relatively small, so they make much bigger profits when you go for the high-end version of the car. So why would they want to make a stripped-down version of an electric vehicle when they know that actually the constraint they have is in getting supply of the batteries? That's always a problem. Fully charged, which I think is great. I watch them every week, and say they've probably had more to do with educating the world about electric vehicles than almost anyone else, because there is so much untruth out there about electric cars. And so keep going, Fully Charged. We love your show, but it's just, I think, important to sometimes do a little bit of a response to it and fact check it sometimes, and add a bit of reality to the situation. So anyway, I'd like to thank everybody for watching. If you've hung on this long, I'll be talking about the e-Niro again in the next video. Thanks now. Bye.